Hi everyone, happy Tuesday. I know it's been a while since we've read a chapter. I've been busy cleaning out our classroom. So today I'll probably read 2 chapters. So we left off on chapter 3, which is Connie Men versus the Secret Service. It began with seashells. The earliest form of American-made money was wampum. Beads made from white and purple seashells and strung into decorative belts by Native Americans of the Northeast. Back in the early 1600s, before colonies had their own coins or paper bills, settlers and Indians used wampum belts as a form of currency. The belts could be exchanged for different amounts of goods, depending on size and design. Purple beads, for instance, were worth a bit more than white, because the shells needed to make them were harder to find. Pretty soon, America's first counterfeiters were dyeing white shells and passing them off as purple. The colony of Massachusetts was the first to set up a mint and began issuing silver coins in 1652. Counterfeiters immediately began making pewter copies. The same happened with early paper currency, thanks to resourceful folks like Mary Butterworth of Rehoboth, Massachusetts. Butterworth, a mother of 7, used the family kitchen as her workroom. First, she'd get her iron good and hot in the fire. Then she'd put a genuine paper bill on the table and cover it with a damp cloth. As she ran the iron over the cloth, some of the ink from the money was transferred to the cloth. Quickly and carefully, she laid the cloth on a blank piece of paper and pressed down hard with her iron. This transferred the ink from the cloth to the paper, leaving a perfect outline of the original currency's design. Butterworth always threw her used cloths into the fire after using them. The final step was to use a fine quill pen to darken the design of the fake bill and fill in the lettering. Beginning in about 1715, Butterworth spent 7 years producing a fortune in counterfeit Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut currency. Her brothers and other relatives acted as distributors, selling the bills for half their face value, unusually high for Connie, which means that her fakes were of very high quality. The bills were finally noticed and traced to her house, but the court-ordered search turned up no evidence. It was all ashes in her kitchen fireplace. In the decades after the American Revolution, the U.S. government produced gold and silver coins, but no national paper currency. Counterfeiters didn't mind. Coins were easier to fake. Simply take a real coin and make a mold of the design. Then melt a cheap metal, pour it into the mold, let it harden, and cover the fake coin with a thin plate of real gold or silver. Those who really cared about doing quality work took the extra time to give their coins a handled, tarnished look by rubbing them with sawdust and burning them with fire. The process wasn't technically challenging, but each coin took time, and each required genuine gold or silver. Counterfeiting coins was a small-time criminal enterprise. As a result, fake coins weren't a huge problem. In 1860, the government figured that less than 2% of the coins in circulation were phony. Counterfeiting went big time during the Civil War, which started in 1861. As war ripped the country apart, the U.S. government suddenly needed piles of cash to pay millions of soldiers and buy supplies for the massive Union Army. Congress responded with the Legal Tender Act, and President Abraham Lincoln signed it into law. The new law gave the U.S. Treasury the power to print paper currency. Government printing presses started pumping out hundreds of millions of dollars, and counterfeiters started copying it. Making fake paper money was a lot trickier than making coins. For a successful operation, you needed a whole network of distributors and shovers to spread the Connie in various cities. You needed lots of cash to put together the team and to pay for the most vital member, a talented, experienced engraver. But none of this discouraged Connie men, since the potential payoff was so great. In 1864, an astounding 50% of the money in circulation was fake. This was becoming a gigantic problem for honest business owners. Say you own a store and a guy comes in and buys $5 worth of stuff. He pays with a 20 and you give him $15 in change. But then, when you go to put the 20 in the bank, they tell you it's Connie, worthless. So you've lost the $5 worth of goods and the 15 you gave in change. Americans were beginning to lose faith in the green slips of paper. And if citizens stopped trusting the currency, there'd be no way for the government to pay for the war. The entire economy would collapse. A very frightened Treasury Department responded in 1865 by creating the Secret Service and charging the agency with leading the fight against counterfeiters. Today we think of Secret Service agents as the guys in dark suits protecting the president, but that happened later. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, then President James Garfield in 1881, and then President William McKinley in 1901. Only then did it occur to Congress that someone should be guarding the president, and they gave the job to the Secret Service. Back in the 1870s, the one and only task of the Secret Service was to stop the counterfeiters. On January 19, 1876, Ben and Allie Boyd went on trial in a Chicago courtroom packed with spectators. As Terrell and others testified against the defendants, Allie held a handkerchief to her eyes, weeping pathetically. For some reason, the judge bought her act. After hearing the evidence in the case, Terrell grumbled, the judge ordered the jury to find Almiranda Boyd not guilty, it being conceded that she was the wife of Benjamin Boyd, and that as such she had only done what was her duty to her husband by covering up his guilt as much as possible. Allie was acquitted, but the jury took just 20 minutes to find Ben Boyd guilty. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in Joliet State Prison. So acquitted means she was found not guilty, but he was. The conviction was a huge win for the Secret Service. As a reward for busting Boyd, Chief Washburn promoted Terrell to chief operative of the Chicago district of the Secret Service, covering the states of Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin. A nice honor, but it wasn't going to make his life any easier. Terrell hung a map of his vast territory on the wall of his Chicago office. With just a few agents working under him, pause for a second, because here's a picture of Secret Service agents in 1865. With just a few agents working under him, he was now responsible for a chunk of land the size of a small country. There were a lot of Connie men still out there, Terrell knew, and they were sure to strike back. But in a million years, he could have never guessed how they were going to do it. That was chapter 3. I'm going to keep going and read chapter 4. So chapter 4 is titled Big Jim. 300 miles to the southwest, in St. Louis, Missouri, a livery stable owner named James Keneley followed the news from Chicago with increasing alarm. He had good reason to be worried. The arrest and conviction of Ben Boyd threatened to bring his entire empire crashing down. Keneley was 37 years old in 1876. Thanks to descriptions in his prison records, we know he was just under 6 feet tall, with a fair complexion and light gray eyes. He'd done time in prison for his horse theft and 2 long stints in the Illinois State Penitentiary for passing counterfeit cash. All that time behind bars taught Keneley some valuable lessons, valuable that is, to a man determined to continue a life of crime. Keneley settled in St. Louis and opened a livery stable with a bit of help from an old friend, none other than Ben Boyd's brother-in-law, Pete McCartney. But Keneley and his investor had no intentions of eking out a living by renting horses. The stable was really just a front, making it appear to the world that these men were legitimate businessmen. In fact, behind the scenes, Keneley set up and managed one of the biggest counterfeiting networks in the Midwest. That's when people started calling him Big Jim. Here's a picture of the Illinois State Penitentiary. So that's the prison he was at. Big Jim had one strict rule. He never touched the stuff himself. Rather than handling piles of potentially incriminating Connie, he accepted orders from counterfeiting gangs around the region. Keneley would then contact an engraver and printer, paying them to produce the needed product. When the Connie was ready, he'd have the printer hide the stash in some predetermined spot in a hollow log out in the country, or in a hole under a roadside rock. The client would be told to pick up his order and to leave his payment. Of course, Keneley only accepted payment in real U.S. currency. It was all wildly profitable, but the entire operation was based on one simple fact. Keneley produced the best, most realistic-looking Connie available. And he was able to do this for one simple reason. He hired the best engraver, Ben Boyd. Boyd's arrest knocked Keneley's system out of joint, and the supply of quality Connie circulating in Midwestern cities began to fall. Bank tellers were among the first to notice. Specially trained to detect counterfeit bills, they were used to spotting about one bogus bill an hour. Now, in the early months of 1876, they might see one a month. New tellers were actually upset about the change. As one banker explained, younger men in the bank complained that there was not enough counterfeit money in circulation for them to learn how to detect it. For young tellers, this was an inconvenience. For Big Jim, it was a catastrophe. He continued taking orders and producing Connie, but everything was harder without Ben Boyd. Other engravers just weren't as talented or meticulous. Fake bills printed from their plates were easier to detect, so they had a shorter life expectancy. For example, say Keneley sold his clients a new batch of $10 bills. Once the police spotted one of these fake tens, they'd distribute descriptions of the bogus bill to business owners and newspapers. They made all the bills in the entire batch just about worthless. Besides, trying to pass inferior Connie was a lot riskier than passing top-notch stuff. Shovers were much more likely to get caught in the act. Naturally, Keneley's clients were not about to pay top dollar for lower quality, riskier merchandise. They demanded steep discounts, and Big Jim had no choice but to agree. His business was falling apart. The men who made their living, mainly by means of Boyd's work, have been down in the mouth ever since his arrest, declared the Chicago Tribune. They have used every means in their power to get him out. The Tribune reporter heard that Boyd's friends had tried to bribe court officials and prison guards, with no luck. Money could not obtain a pardon, the paper explained. Keneley was getting desperate. In early March, he got on a train and rode to Lincoln, Illinois, a town named for the country's 16th president. There he met with members of the Logan County gang, regular customers of his. In flush times, the gang liked to brag that, thanks to them, there was no more bogus than real money floating around Logan County. But business was slow now. The men were eager for any kind of work. And it just so happened that Big Jim had a job for them. He wanted them to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln. Incredibly, Big Jim wasn't the first person to think of stealing a dead president. On a foggy night back in 1830, a young gardener snuck onto the grounds of Mount Vernon, George Washington's Virginia estate. Washington had died in 1799, but the property still belonged to his family. Until a few days before, the gardener had worked at Mount Vernon, but he'd been fired for some unknown reason. Apparently, he was pretty upset about the dismissal. The man felt his way between trees along the soggy ground sloping down from the family house to the banks of the Potomac River. Ahead, he saw a small stone building, exactly what he'd come for, George Washington's burial vault. The gardener pushed through the unlocked door and stood inside. Fog and faint moonlight slanted in through the crumbling stone walls. Looking around, the man saw 20 coffins. A few lay across wooden beams. Others were just stacked on top of each other. The purpose of the vault was to keep the bodies of Washington and his extended family above the often flooding waters of the Potomac. But the vault's intense heat and humidity were causing the wooden coffins to rot and collapse. Several bones had already fallen to the muddy floor. Only the bodies of George and Martha Washington were well protected inside the coffins of lead. And here's the Logan County gang, pictured left to right. So here's the picture of them. So it says left to right. So Benjamin F. Sheridan, Big Jim Keneley, Terrence Mullen, and Jack Hughes. So those were the men that they were talking about before. But the bodies of George and Martha Washington were well protected inside coffins of lead, lying side by side on a wooden table in the corner. The gardener either didn't know this, or was in too big of a hurry, or simply couldn't see much in the dark space. He grabbed what he believed to be George Washington's skull, tucked it under his arm, and ran for home. The missing body part was discovered the next day, and everyone suspected the disgruntled gardener. He was immediately caught and must have been disappointed to learn he'd actually stolen the skull of one of Washington's in-laws. It was returned unharmed to its resting place. Then, just to make sure, Washington's nephew opened George's coffin and took a look inside. He was still in there. Relieved, the family began building a solid, secure brick tomb for George and Martha. You can still visit this one today. Fun fact, I've been there. It's really cool. And here's the entrance to George Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon. 37 years later, in 1867, a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, had a similar idea. His plan, according to two young men he tried to recruit for the job, was to break into the tomb of Abraham Lincoln and steal his coffin. Then he would stash the body somewhere in the South and wait for ransom offers, returning the body to the highest bidder. But no one agreed to help the lawyer. He abandoned the scheme and died a few years later. Only rumors of his plot remained. Did Big Jim Keneley know these stories? Was he inspired by them? There's no way to know. Certainly, he knew about the crime of body snatching, which was a serious problem in the 1860s and 70s. Medical colleges were always in need of bodies for use in human anatomy classes. Schools were willing to pay cash for bodies, no questions asked, and body snatchers filled the demand by digging up and delivering fresh corpses. Big Jim's plan was a bit more ambitious, and the payment he expected was a bit higher than the typical $15 paid by colleges. Following Keneley's detailed instructions, Logan County gang leaders Thomas Sharp picked 4 other gang members. The 5-man team traveled by wagon 30 miles north to Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's former home, and the location of his tomb. The men rented a 2-story building downtown. They opened a saloon on the first floor and turned the second floor into a dance hall. This gave the team a perfect front for their operation. Gang member Robert Splain worked as a bartender, and the other members drifted in one at a time, just like regular customers. They could meet and talk at the bar without attracting any attention. For particularly secret sessions, they could duck into the back room. Keneley's orders were to break into Lincoln's tomb, snatch his body, and bury it in a ditch along the Sangamon River, a few miles north of town. The disappearance of Lincoln's remains would be front-page news all over the country, of course. The government would offer a huge reward for the return of the body. This is where Big Jim planned to make a personal appearance in the story. Only after the body was planted, Keneley was to travel from St. Louis to Springfield. While doing a little fishing in the Sangamon River, he just so happened to stumble on Lincoln's shallow grave. Sure, the police would find Keneley's chance discovery extremely suspicious, but Keneley would have a rock-solid alibi. He was in St. Louis on the night of the theft, with eyewitnesses to prove it. His innocence established, he'd offer to return the body for the right price, naturally. To get back Lincoln's body, the government was going to have to let Ben Boyd out of jail. Big Jim's final touch was the date of the theft, the night of July 3rd. It was the night before Independence Day, and not just any Independence Day. July 4th, 1876, would be the country's 100th birthday, exactly 1 century from the day Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. By the night of July 3rd, the celebration in town would be well underway. No one would notice a few strangers lurking around Lincoln's tomb. And on July 4th, people in Springfield would be so busy with parades and fireworks that they wouldn't notice Lincoln was missing, giving Keneley's crew plenty of time to slip safely out of town. Thomas Sharp and the gang prepared carefully for the big night. One by one, on different days, each man took the 2-mile streetcar ride from downtown Springfield to Oak Ridge Cemetery. Each paid the 25-cent admission fee and walked up a muddy path toward the Lincoln Monument. Do you think their plan is going to work? Do you think they're going to be able to steal his body? I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Hope you're enjoying this. I think it's getting really good. I'm really, I want to keep reading it. Until tomorrow, leave me your thoughts in the comments on Google Classroom. Bye, guys.